We can also not have a cold open.
We can also not have a cold open. No, I think instead of that, for this episode, we're gonna need Biomonic Ninja.
Yeah,
because there's that ridiculous video of these like the Bosnian Serbs driving through Zaire, and there's like streets lined with people, and they're blasting Biomonic Ninja, the Serbian nationalist folk artist, who I think we talked about in an episode. I think way back in the day.
I mean, we did an episode on like post-Yugo nationalist music, right?
Yeah, we did.
So I think maybe he was there.
But even as somebody who knew about the White Legion, like until I saw that, I didn't make the connection that that's what was happening. They were just like driving through Kisangani, like listening to fucking Baya.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Horrible.
All right. Welcome back to The Empire Never Ended with Boris and Ray.
Hello.
Rayford,
yes.
Raymundo. We are back today in our part 3 of our Congo mercenaries episode, where we'll finally get to the mercenaries that I initially planned to do this episode about. This turned into a series. So today we'll be talking about the so-called White Legion. Which is primarily Bosnian Serbs who fought on the side of Mobutu.
Yeah, we finally come to the Balkan connection. We did also take it back to the 19th century, I guess, but 19th century in Congo. Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
But that was in the first episode. So where we last left off, if you remember from the last episode, Mobutu's Zaire was falling apart pretty quickly in 1996, when it was being invaded by a multinational force led by Rwanda, with the nominal presence of Congolese rebels led by Laurent Desire Kabila. We talked about his 30-plus year rule and kind of a speed run through Mobutu's rule, where he was able to rely on Western backers to support his regime when threatened, whether it was from his rise to power at the backs of, with the aid of Nazi and neocolonialist mercenaries doing the CIA's bidding, to the Shaba crisis in the 1970s that we briefly mentioned, when French and Moroccan paratroopers came to his assistance to help repel rebels that were invading from Angola, with, of course, American money flowing through the whole time. And by 1996, where we left off last time, Mobutu's support had largely dried up, except for the French, who were kind of reluctant to give direct support, especially coming after their scandalous role in Rwanda during the Rwandan genocide. Nevertheless, the French did help out, and that's what we're going to start talking about today. So the way that this French support happened is a rather odd connection. Nowadays we know of private military corporations, private military companies became pretty normalized and widespread.
Yeah.
Especially in like the War on Terror era. And now it's everywhere. Now we don't even think twice about the fact that there's mercenaries engaged all over the world in all these different conflicts. And of course, it was happening before too. I mean, obviously in the 1960s, there were lots of mercenary outfits working throughout the world. But I think the presence of private military companies just wasn't as normalized as it is today. And so the company that kind of facilitated this connection between French intelligence services and then kind of Serbian state security was a company front group, officially a telecommunications company, but obviously like a private military contractor called GeoLink.
Okay.
It's just kind of a rather benign name. And it's one of those things where it's easy to kind of think like, oh, well, how real is this? There's a lot of conspiracy theories whenever you talk about anything related to intelligence agencies, right?
Of course.
So I did a little bit of kind of reading on that as well. And so, for example, you can find an article in the New York Times from May 1997, called France Linked to Defense of Mobutu. France has conducted a covert military operation to prop up Mobutu Sese Seko, the Zairian leader, as rebels advanced across the country, according to American intelligence reports, and an official in a company that French intelligence used to cover for the operation. The operation, which began within weeks of the outbreak of the rebellion, involved obtaining 3 combat aircraft from Yugoslavia. It's actually a lot more than that, from Mr. Mobutu's forces, along with the pilots and mechanics for them, and the services of at least 80 mercenaries in early January.
So the Yugoslavia they talk about is the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which is Serbia and Montenegro, ruled, dominated by Milosevic in the 90s. Yeah.
Yes. Most of the mercenaries were Serbs. Others were Belgians and French.
Okay.
Then, it goes on. And it basically says it's this company, GeoLink, is involved, and that it's kind of, actually, I'll read it. A spokesperson for the French Foreign Ministry, Jacques Mladić, denied that the French government was involved with any covert operation in Zaire or with GeoLink, a company that the intelligence reports have cited as part of the operation. France condemns all mercenary activity in Zaire, the spokesperson said. Details of the operation are murky, as is characteristic of many covert operations. And Western diplomats said it was quite possible that French intelligence service might have been running this operation without other branches of the government knowing about it. Mm-hmm. One European diplomat in the region compared it to the kind of operation concealed from other branches of the American government that Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North ran from the Reagan White House. It goes on to say how much money was involved and how the Serbian mercenaries in Zaire were reportedly paid between $3,000 to $5,000 a month, et cetera, and that that their liaison was a Serb who would call himself Colonel Dominic Yugo. And we'll start talking about him soon. So obviously from the article, you can see that there was some, in their words, murky business going on. Mm-hmm. And indeed, if you want to get a whole lot of mercenaries with plenty of wartime experience, the former Yugoslavia in 1996-7 wasn't a bad place to look, right? But the White Legion, as it came to be known, was not just a random selection of veterans that, kind of in the sense of like how the recruits came into the commando units in the 1960s, where, they had an office in South Africa and then different people signed up. And, mm-hmm. There were people with some military experience and from different backgrounds, all this. That's not really the case here. Because the people that comprise this unit, the White Legion, came from one of the strangest and most infamous units in the Bosnian War, which is the 10th Sabotage Unit of the Army of the Bosnian Serb Republic. Now, before we get into the background of the 10th Sabotage Detachment, I would first like to introduce their commander, who we heard about in the New York Times article, who is a real like Tenepod character in pretty much every way. Very strange and fucked up guy who was actually one of the people that wasn't really involved in the 10th Sabotage Detachment.
He wasn't the commander of the unit. He became the commander of the unit in Congo.
He became the commander of the unit in Congo, but was not part of the 10th Sabotage Detachment during the war in Bosnia.
Yeah.
His name is Yugoslav Petrušić Dominic, which is his French nom de guerre, also known as Yugo Dominic or Colonel Dominic. Petrušić was born in a village near the town of Leskovac in southern Serbia in 1962. And after completing his military schooling in Yugoslavia, he went on to France, where he joined the French Foreign Legion, which, kind of on a side note, there are a lot of former legionnaires involved in the Yugoslav conflicts, from the commander of like the Serbian state securities military unit, the Red Berets, Milorad Ulimic Legia, to like the Croatian general Ante Gotovina, and many others.
But when was Yugoslav Petrušić in the Legion?
Well, so this is, his biography does kind of get murky here, in the sense that, so I mean, I'd imagine this is 80s. It says that he took part, I don't know, they say that he took part in all kinds of things in like French Foreign Legion operations in the Middle East and Africa. So I think in Algeria, in Lebanon, he was there. He was, I think, took part in the first Gulf War with the Foreign Legion, and was apparently even on the security detail for French President François Mitterrand.
Okay.
Which is interesting. I'm not sure how true that is, because like with this guy, and one of the reasons he's kind of a tenafod figure is that like we'll get to this maybe at the end of the episode if we have time, because he is like a guy that's highly active on the like internet and media now. And it's always this weird, I was telling Ray a couple of days ago, like sometimes he'll drop some like interesting knowledge and like documents proving connections of this group and that group, and then just start talking about like the wildest conspiracy theories. Yeah. Like you can imagine. He has his own kind of weird race science or something. I don't know. It's real weird. But apparently, yes, he was definitely a legionnaire. He definitely had some experience. You know, the French Foreign Legion operates even to this day all over the place, and their guys really do get experience. I just don't know whether the Mitterrand thing is true or not.
We will call him Yugo Dominic, right?
Yeah, we'll call him Yugo Dominic, okay. or Colonel Dominic. I think Dominic was just maybe easier for our listeners to remember.
Yeah.
What is definitely for certain is that he was recruited at some point to be a French intelligence asset, to be, you know, whatever, an intelligence agent or some division of French intelligence services, which I'm not super familiar with, admittedly. And reports of his activities in the Yugoslav wars kind of vary as well, which again, I guess he's a spy. So, you know, it's,
yeah.
You know, in some biographies, it says that he took part in the war in Bosnia. In another article I read, and this seems to kind of jibe with some other stuff that I've seen, he arrived in Bosnia in 92, but with a French UNPROFOR UN contingent as an intelligence agent.
Okay.
So he kind of surfaces in, like, what we do know is that he took part in the rescue and eventual exchange of 2 French pilots who were shot down in Bosnia during NATO's Operation Deliberate Force against the Bosnian Serbs in 1995. And it seems that this is where he says that he made contact with the 10th Sabotage Division, in that he arranged for the French pilots to be guarded by them until they had the exchange, until they were, you know, given back to the French government, which was done in a big ceremony. General Ratko Mladić came and escorted them to like these French officers, and, you know, they said that they were well treated or whatever. And this is supposedly the work of Yugo Dominic, right? He's the one that kind of set that whole thing up. And whether or not he had connections to this unit before that, who knows? As an asset, you know, to both the French and I guess to the Serbian state security, he was definitely qualified for organizing their later activities in Zaire, especially given the fact that this 10th Sabotage Detachment's roots also lie in the intelligence apparatus of Republika Srpska.
Which is basically a part of Milosevic's intelligence, right?
Right. I mean, actually, maybe this is a good point to mention kind of the role of like intelligence services. Ray, if you can kind of just give us a little
Okay. We talked...
Well, because we talked about this before, yeah.
We talked about this specifically when we went on Radio Warner to talk about the Red Berets, I guess. So when the war... Well, even before the war started in Yugoslavia, Milosevic's regime, and Milosevic was, remember, he was the president of Serbia, which was one of the republics of Yugoslavia. But Yugoslavia was, federalized in such a way that even the state security or intelligence of Yugoslavia had its branches organized in different republics. So there was state security of Serbia, state security of Croatia, and so on. And state security of Serbia was completely under Milosevic's control and was used in Milosevic's preparation for the war in Croatia and in Bosnia in different ways. So agents of state security would go to Croatia and try to organize the local Serbs there, and even to somehow to encourage them basically to participate in a war. People did not want to be in a war, and the role of these people was to, in a way, encourage them, or even to create situations so that it's really kind of the war was inevitable or seemed inevitable for the locals there. So what was specific about the state security of Serbia was they created their own paramilitaries. At first, these was many different paramilitary units that were often all referred to as Red Berets. And then specifically it was formalized into one unit in the 90s called the Unit for Special Operations, which was also called Red Berets. But this was like a formal military unit of state security that existed in the 90s. And there were many other informal ones that existed that were connected to state security and basically run by state security. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean this, and there were, to varying degrees, state intelligence services of all the different countries did their own kind of covert actions.
Yes.
But none of them really had the same kind of, like a military unit directly under the command of the intelligence service.
No.
Which this one in Republika Srpska is pretty much that, right? So
yeah, so that would be one of the units that the Serbian state security controlled, I guess. And this one formally was a part of the military of the Serbian Republic in Bosnia.
Right.
So it wasn't formally a part of the state security, but it was one of the units that was controlled by them, it seems.
Yeah, and even though it wasn't, the whole point of these kind of covert actions for Serbia is also that it could have plausible deniability of like taking part in these conflicts, right? Because it's more of a covert thing. But in this case, we'll see that, like, for example, this detachment trained in Serbia or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody knew those connections were there, but, you want to have intelligence groups to keep kind of some things.
So it seems they're a part of this kind of extended Red Berets family of paramilitaries.
Yeah.
I mean, so one other that we mentioned were the Scorpions, notorious unit that also did war crimes in the vicinity of Srebrenica.
Yep.
Yeah,
so this is all that kind of expanded family.
Yeah.
Fucked up. I mean, but it is like a unique and strange unit for kind of a number of reasons. And maybe some of our Yugo listeners would be familiar with some of this and maybe not.
But it was also kind of specific because there were like conspiracy theories about them even in the 90s, like during Milosevic's rule.
Well, because information came out about them right after the war, basically.
Yeah.
And I mean, we'll get there, I think, first. Yeah. Maybe we should get into like who they are and how they were established. So the 10th Sabotage Detachment was founded on the 14th of October, 1994, by the order of the Commander General Ratko Mladić, the famous war criminal.
Who used to be a general in the Yugoslav People's Army. In the beginning of war, was active in the war as such. And then when, Yugoslavia broke up, he became the main military leader and general in the army of the Serbs from Bosnia, or the army of the Serbian Republic. In Bosnia.
Yes. And it was intended to be a sabotage / commando unit but under the direct control of the Central Command of the Army, and more specifically, would report to the intelligence wing of the Central Command. So their orders kind of came directly from HQ. It's said that Mladić like kind of knew, or kind of gave them orders, and they reported directly to like the head of the military intelligence. And so that makes it kind of unique in that sense. It was a very relatively small unit at the beginning. It started off with, I think, less than 100 men, who were broken up into 2 platoons, one that was based in Bielina, one in Vlasenica. And its commander was a guy by the name of Milorad Mišo Pelemiš. Pelemiš would later be the deputy commander of the White Legion when they went to Zaire. But he was the commander of this unit. So Pelemiš was born in the Bosnian village of Pelemiši in 1964. Served in the Yugoslav army before the war as a junior officer in the kind of anti-terrorist special forces in the military police. So he was like, some sort of commando. He took part in the war in Croatia and then in Bosnia, where he eventually attained the rank of captain. He actually died relatively recently, 2021, I think, as a free man who, kind of escaped the fate of many of his, many other members of the unit, who, many of them went to prison for war crimes and the like. Even though he was, of course, a straight up like war criminal through and through. He was kind of protected by the Serbian state later on. And even though he himself was also convicted of being a foreign intelligence agent as well.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's kind of, he's a real fucked up guy, I gotta say.
Okay.
As you might imagine. I mean, Yugo Dominic's a fucked up guy, but like this guy, like really seems like a psycho. Like a lot of the stuff that we know about Yugo Dominic, at least that I know about him, that's fucked up, comes from his from what he was doing in Congo, or at least that he was accused of doing directly in Congo, and then later as well. But what really kind of stood out as the strangest thing about the 10th Sabotage Detachment was its general composition. I think, as many of our listeners might know, you can break down the Bosnian War into kind of 3 main fighting forces: the Bosnian Serb army, the Croatian Defense Council, the Bosnian Croats, and then the Army of the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which, kind of roughly broke down along ethnic lines, right? The strange thing about this unit was that it was much more multi-ethnic than one would expect. Yeah. Certainly more multi-ethnic than any other units in the Bosnian Serb army, with some exceptions. So you have members that included an ethnic Slovene, Franz Kos, who was one of the platoon commanders. He had previously, I think, been in the Slovene Home Guard, then fought and then was part of the Croatian Defense Council, and then was in the Bosnian Army, and then ended up in the Bosnian Serb Army.
So he fought in all of the armies?
Not all of them. There is a guy who fought in all of them. So he also had several ethnic Croats too. Guy Marko Boškić, for example, and Dražen Erdemović, who was the kind of main witness that kind of uncovered all of the crimes. He actually served in every army. Okay. So he was in the Yugoslav People's Army in 91 in Croatia, even though he's an ethnic Croat. I think he was then in also the Croatian Defense Council, the Bosnian Army, and then the Army of Republika Srpska. So he really actually checked them all off.
Are there any explanations how these things happened?
Yes. Okay. And the unit had at least one Muslim member, Zijad Žigić. There was apparently another one, but he may have been executed under Pelemiš's orders. That again, some of these things get kind of crazy with this unit because, and then of course the rest of them tended to be Serbs. And some of them also came from the kind of criminal underworld, as these things tended to work. Like there's this complete psycho, Stanko Savanović Geza, who was connected to Group America.
Okay.
Which we talked about. I think I have episode 203.
Okay.
Which you can give us a quick maybe refresher on them.
Well, Grupa America was the name for this organized crime group that was given to them by the Serbian state security because it involved Serbs and Montenegrins living in the United States. And it's the longest, I think, existing or the longest existing Yugoslav criminal organized crime group that I think ever existed, because they probably exist since the 70s in some form or another. We talked about Boško Radinić, who was one of their leaders, who at one point was also the leader, the head of the Irish American gang, the Westies.
Yeah.
It's a very strange story. They are suspected by some foreign journalists to have connections with the CIA. This came to light because there are some sealed indictments against some of their leaders who still live in the United States, and they're heavily involved in the drug business in South America.
Yeah,
it seems that they were protected there to some degree, but they were also in close connection with the Serbian state security in the 90s. Although previously they had a whole history and connection, or kind of dual identity, as also anti-communist terrorists.
Yeah.
In the 70s and the 80s. In the 90s, they made this alliance with the Milosevic regime, and some of them came back and lived in Serbia in the 90s. Although they were completely unknown, the public learned of their existence only, 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, the public didn't know about their existence really as such an international group in the 90s. So in the 90s, they had a close alliance with state security, and they would be kind of the enforcers for the state security and would assassinate people for the state, for the Milosevic regime, until they kind of fell there was a decline of their influence, and they were really kind of deposed by their rival gang from a part of Belgrade called Zemun, the Zemun gang, who then started doing that function for state security instead of them.
Yeah.
So it's a really bizarre group that still exists, and some of their bosses are, I think, live in New York City, that had connections with the intelligence of the United States and Serbia, and yeah.
I mean, it's not a super relevant. It's not a major connection here, but I was interesting to me that I found out that this guy was basically some sort of like bodyguard or enforcer who worked for Voya, the American, in the 90s, and was also like a human trafficker. He's like a real big fucking scumbag, as you might imagine. But like, it's interesting to me because we've talked about Group America, and it also has so many intelligence connections that when you're looking at like a unit like this that has all kinds of sketchy figures, then you get to somebody with a Group America connection. You're like, well, that's funny, isn't it? How strange. So as you ask, how did this come to be? Right? How does this happen? How do you get all these people seemingly from all these different backgrounds who served pretty much in everybody's army? Like that guy Zijad Žigić, the Muslim guy, he also obviously he was in the Bosnian army. Then he comes over. Very unusual, right, for this time period. To have a guy like that around in the Bosnian Serb army. And in many ways, that 10th Sabotage Detachment's kind of an example. It's kind of a classic example of like a penal battalion. Mm-hmm. Like pretty much every war has them, which is, you take prisoners, put them in a unit and send them into, to die as cannon fodder. Obviously Wagner did a lot of that. Right? The Ukrainians do that as well. I mean, it's a feature of every war, but like, it's been in the news a lot recently, right? Because of the Ukraine war. And it is true that pretty much all of the non-Serbs that were part of this unit were in some way or another involved with, like smuggling, basically. Mm-hmm. so most of them actually switched sides in like 93, and I think all of them were in the area of Tuzla, which was under Bosnian government control. And most of them admit to have been involved in smuggling in some ways, although I think every one of them says that their smuggling was like helping, for example, ethnic Serbs cross into the Serb side or whatever. Although, knowing how these things work, I'd imagine that, knowing how pervasive smuggling was in general, that they were also probably doing a lot of other stuff.
Yeah.
Too. Right. I mean, this is something it happens in every conflict, but, especially in these areas under Bosnian government control, we're kind of lacking pretty much everything. There's lots of smuggling economy going on, lots of, trading of stuff back and forth. So I'm guessing that like when they say that they were helping people out, it's their way of kind of coming out.
Yeah.
It's like, we weren't like, doing anything bad, but that's pretty much where all of those guys come from. So, at some point or another, they all end up.
So they were probably arrested and then given a choice.
Or left because they thought that they were going to get arrested. And then, when they cross sides, I think most of them were initially put into some sort of camp, right? Because they're from from the enemy side, right? Now, if you ask like Palamish, for example, he claims that like the Croats, for example, crossed over because they became disillusioned in 93 when the Croats and the Bosnian army started fighting one another, that they preferred then to fight on the Serbian side. That doesn't really add up to what they say.
Yeah.
But that's what he says. But, I think he has a more vested interest in portraying them as, patriots of some kind. They realize that those are the bad guys. But I think what made it different from the typical penal battalion, and also what separated it from any of the other units in the Bosnian Serb army, is that it was actually a contract-based unit. So they were paid, and they signed contracts, and they would get paid to do certain operations. So it was in essence a mercenary force that was hired and controlled by the intelligence services, which is interesting because I think even the other, like, for example, the Red Berets, the unit for special operations, they weren't like a contract unit. No, they were paid.
Yes.
But they weren't like paid by the job or whatever. This is kind of it's an interesting setup. And I'm not really sure. I mean, I guess nobody will know for sure why they set it up that way. And I wonder if it is kind of a way, given what they would be doing later on, of also having some sort of degree of, deniability. Like these people are like contract soldiers. Yeah. They're mercenary scumbag criminals or something. Yeah. You know what I mean? So when you can use them to do your dirty work and then kind of write them off later. And this is something that comes up, right? Because their connection to intelligence later on comes to like, produce all kinds of conspiracy theories and all this. And I think we can talk about that a little bit later.
I mean, this is all like really extremely shady, even what we...
I was saying this kind of stuff nonchalantly a little bit, but it is like an extremely strange thing, right? I mean, that in kind of the middle of like the worst years of the war, right, you get this unit formed that has all these different people. They're basically contract killers, who would then get implicated in some of the worst things that happened, right? So, because officially, like I said, it was supposed to be some sort of commando behind enemy lines, sabotage detachment, right? You put on the uniform of the opposing side, you go, you blow up a bridge, you do this and that. Typical kind of commando operations. But of course, what they're best known for is basically being genocidaires. In Srebrenica, obviously, I think most of our listeners know, when the killing of 8,000 plus Bosniak men and boys who were executed by the Bosnian Serb army and paramilitaries in July of 1995. Yeah. So, they're a unit that gets that is supposed to be kind of highly specialized. They get this guy Belamish, who has background in this kind of anti-terrorist operations and stuff like that. And, they do some of that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at like what they really did,
Mm-hmm.
it's not this kind of heroic,
No.
badass behind enemy lines kind of stuff. Instead, it's, killing unarmed prisoners. So in some sense, kind of they would fit in with the archetype of the Mad Mike, right?
Yeah.
But obviously in a very different context. Those people had an easy time doing that stuff to other people. I don't know how easily they would have done that in, England, or Northern Ireland or Rhodesia or whatever against their own people. So the 10th Sabotage Unit actually takes part in the seizing of the UN safe area of Srebrenica on July 11th, 1995. So they enter the city virtually, unopposed. Members of the unit are tasked with preparing the ground for the arrival of Mladić and the other generals to, parade around the city or whatever. There's lots of famous videos of that, whatever. But preparing the ground for them means basically ransacking houses, stealing shit. Belamish, there's a couple different accounts of this. Orders, the beating and killing of a civilian unarmed man who happened to be kind of roaming around still in the city center. They, on Marko Boškić's account, is that Belamish kills him himself.
Mm-hmm.
The other accounts say that he tasked this guy, Zoran Obrenović Mladić, who I don't want to put too many names in, but I do want to put this guy's name in because it gives you kind of an idea how what big of psychopaths these are, because this nickname Mladić comes from mal, which is like a mallet that he was, I guess, famous for killing people with.
Yeah. Which is especially ironic for like Serbs because like, mal or, sledgehammer or mallet is like what, the Ustašas are known for using against Serbs. So I guess this is some kind of a revenge or something. I don't know.
Yeah. But he, that's his nickname.
Yeah.
Which is not, bad people.
Yeah.
Just very bad people.
It's Serbs who would like to be more like Ustašas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they made that clear here pretty well. So after, they secure the terrain, which again, ransacking, killing people, for Mladić, they kind of withdraw from the city to their bases. Belamish gets into a car accident that evening in a vehicle, in an armored vehicle that they stole from the UN.
Okay.
They flip that over down a fucking cliff, and the driver is killed. Belamish, the commander, is wounded, although not super seriously, but seriously enough that this kind of ends up being a lucky break for him because he gets to go to the hospital. And then later, when they're trying to prosecute him for certain war crimes, he'd be like, "Oh, I wasn't there for that. I was, in the hospital."
Yeah,
something like that. He's the commander of the unit that goes on to do some pretty horrible things, or that was already doing horrible things. But so yeah, that happens to him. And then in the meantime, afterwards, members of the unit are tasked to do various things, such as the kind of gathering of men and boys, detainees. They're taking part in some of these actions, but then 10 were initially selected. I think 8 ended up going to a special operation for them. And this is like, there's again some, if you want to get really, really depressed, like I did when I was doing this, you can listen to hours and hours of testimony by these people where they talk about this really at length. But, it is very clear that Belamish knew exactly what was about to happen. In fact, I think Franz Kos says he overheard him talking to another guy, another commander, who was like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna have to hide all of that. We're gonna have to bury all of that." And so that is what's coming up. So on July 16th, 8 members of the unit, including the platoon commander Franz Kos, were ordered to a farm in the village of Branjevo, where they took part in executing busload after busload of prisoners. People with their hands tied behind their backs. So between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., they had killed 1,200 people, roughly. That's an incredible amount of people to kill in a very short period of time. And we know some of these numbers too, because that psycho Stanko Savanovic, the Group America guy, was like gleefully counting how many people he killed. Like he was, kind of proud of it. And afterwards, it's this really like the accounts of this are like really obviously very horrible. They go afterwards and like have a beer in a cafe, like across the street. There's just piles of bodies, and over the next few weeks, then members of the unit take part in other killings, none of which are like on that scale, but still like, several dozen people. And they take part in covering up a lot of this, right? Digging these mass graves, moving bodies, that kind of thing as well. So the 8 members who did take part in those mass killings in Branjevo were then later issued IDs with different names so that they could go hide out in Serbia.
Wow.
Yeah. So, so much for, Bellamish not being there.
Yeah.
This is a guy that kind of got away with it, as did some of the others. And the unit did take part in other actions, but, not too many. Of course, part of that was also guarding those French pilots, and that's what they meet up with Colonel Yugo for the first time, apparently. But, Pelemish, for example, was awarded like presented with an official battle flag by the Army High Command, not specifically for this, but it's for this. But that's also when they try to say later on, like, oh no, that was kind of rogue elements. They were controlled by foreign powers, this and that. No, I mean these people involved were awarded like military honors, and of course given IDs to flee with, and all this other kind of stuff under the protection of the Bosnian Serb army and state, right? So it's pretty clear what's going on there. I'm not exactly sure how much money they were given for it. There were stories that like a general, some sort of commander came up to them and was like, after they had done all those killings and said, you guys will be rewarded for your service very well or whatever, go on vacation now or something. Just, you're going to have a great vacation after you just murdered 1,200 people. And for some people, this wasn't like an easy thing. For example, the guy, Dražen Demović, is the first person to kind of break out of that in 96 already. He turns witness and starts, revealing kind of what they had done. Right.
Well, he's the guy who was like the Milosevic regime transferred him to The Hague, right? Is that true?
Yeah, because he had been living in Serbia at the time and came forward and said, like, I killed all these people.
Yeah, but they sent him to The Hague, right?
I believe so, yeah. Although, the members of the unit did try to kill him in like immediately after, because in his account, I mean, he had like was not okay with what was happening while it was happening. And like, I guess one person was trying to plead for his life and he was just being like, maybe I can help you, when the other guys just killed him. And so they kind of saw him as a liability, and they had that guy Stanko Savanovic shoot him in a bar. Which Pelemiš, when asked about that now, says that like, oh, they were fighting over a prostitute or something. And like, there's a lot of like, these guys did not get along at some point. They get into like a lot of factional beefs later on. And, that guy Zia Djigic is like a real psychopath too. And there's a lot of like testimony of his, not testimony. I mean, he's free and living in Bosnia now. But like him pretty openly talking about like,
he lives with the Serbs or?
Yeah, with the Serbs. About like, oh yeah, this guy's an asshole. Yeah, we got in a fight and the bullets were, but that's how things are. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
So like, yeah, I mean, this is an example. This is who these people are. And even though like, one of them came forward, for the rest of them, it was a kind of omerta, right? In that Zia Djigic said himself, the sabotageurs never talk about their actions. This is when they asked him about, because he says he wasn't in Srebrenica, that he was with the other platoon somewhere else.
He's a Bosnian Muslim guy.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, it would be a thing like, well, did he participate? He said, no. And I only found out about that later.
Mm-hmm.
And then he said something like, the sabotageurs never talk about their actions. That's why we got paid the big bucks or whatever.
Mm-hmm. But he was in Srebrenica. Or?
It's not clear.
Okay.
He says he wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
But look, they participated. If he wasn't there when those 8 people, because we know exactly who those 8 people were taking part in like the big killing, right? And it's worth mentioning. Obviously, they're not the only ones that were doing this. There were regular units of the army and all these paramilitaries, the Scorpions that you mentioned before, that were doing the others, right? Yeah. But they did also take part in the kind of logistical operation of like all the things you need to do to facilitate and get rid of killing thousands of people.
Yeah.
Right. So like there's no way ever that he didn't know what was going on.
Yeah.
So yeah, now with all that in mind, we go back to Mobutu. Such a pleasant song. So yeah, this is who Mobutu tasks with defending his regime, saving his regime at the final hour, right?
This plus the one that we mentioned at the beginning, Yugo Dominic.
Right. So Yugo Dominic is through the French intelligence network and certainly his connections to Serbian state security is the one tasked with assembling this mercenary force. I will note that he objects strongly to the portrayal of this as a mercenary operation.
Okay.
Like I said, he's involved online and responds to comments and writes in the third person, which is always funny. But
so
says,
they were a bunch of idealists, or what?
No, he says that that it wasn't it wasn't a mercenary operation. It was an operation by the Serbian state that they did to make money, and that they had like a humanitarian mission to end the civil war in the Congo.
It seems like an operation by the French state in cooperation with the Serbian state.
Yeah, absolutely.
That used a bunch of psychos. Yeah.
No, there's a kind of win-win aspect to it for everybody involved, right? For the French. There's also supposedly some murky Russian underworld intelligence agent that was also involved with this, which I have a feeling might be true. Which I'll get to in a second, because they also bought some equipment from former Soviet republics. But yes, he claims it wasn't just a mercenary operation. I think everybody in the world also disagrees with that. Because by the time that, Dominic, Mladić, Kos, and like 200 other so guys show up in Zaire in late 1996, early 1997, and the situation didn't look too good, and their performance wasn't, very stellar. And this is, of course, where we get to the video that I mentioned in the very beginning of them driving through, listening to Baya and all this stuff.
Yeah.
To that end, too, there's also videos that Yugo uploaded to the internet that I'll put in Patreon, which kind of shows them in a combat situation where Mladić just kind of seems to be fumbling with like a rocket launcher. And given the fact that, like, I guess the accounts say that they were wasted the entire time, he does not look like he's in good shape. But
this is the unit that just did Srebrenica.
Yeah. No, like they're going in what I think December 96, January 97. I think that maybe Yugo arrives before. So basically they didn't show up empty handed. They come with, first of all, a lot of weapons. And this is where what he's saying is probably true, right? In the sense that the Serbian state was doing this to make money, obviously. And this is this is right when the sanctions are over, before the new round of sanctions.
Sanctions against Serbia.
Sanctions against Serbia. There's a huge surplus of weapons from Bosnia, a lot of which are set to be destroyed under like the peace agreements and stuff. And this is a great way of selling that, making some money off of it, right?
Yeah. 96 was a year of culture in Serbia. That's
Yeah.
what the state officially decided. It was a big campaign. We are going back to what it really matters, culture. The war is over. We're doing culture.
Oh yeah. I know those posters from that era.
Yeah.
Yeah. With like the yeah.
Yeah. In meantime, in Zaire,
they're selling off, weapons to the tune of tens of millions of dollars to Mobutu's people, both to, I think, equip their army and then, to set the stage for these mercenaries to come. There's also, again, no way that the state was not involved with this because they came with a whole air wing.
Yeah.
So like 4 Mi-24 attack helicopters, which was like advanced, even like the Yugoslav army didn't have those. They bought those from the Republic of Georgia and shipped them over.
Okay.
Somebody bought them. It wasn't Yugo Dominic himself or fucking Geolink or whatever.
Yeah.
They also came with several other helicopters, I think like 4 or 5 more. 3 Yugoslav-built Yastreb and Galeb attack jets, which again, don't just end up in Zaire.
Yeah.
And as we know from our first Congo mercenary episode, air power was a major decisive factor in those mercenaries being able to put Mobutu into power. Because again, those mercenaries there weren't a ton of them. There were also just a few hundred of them. But, they had a whole air unit with the pilots that were the Cuban anti-Castros and all the coordination by the CIA and U.S. military and stuff. That was a very important thing to have. So you would think that this would help these guys, halt the advance of the Rwandan forces, Kabila's, rebel group or whatever. But, it doesn't really go that way. So Colonel Dominic's forces make their base at the airport in the northeastern city of Kisangani. And, like I said, being well equipped and having the advantage of air superiority, and the rebels and the Rwandan forces there didn't particularly have any kind of anti-air capability. So it should have been pretty smooth sailing for them, right? It didn't really help them at all. They were ineffective for a lot of reasons. So I got a very dry, like military analysis book that has a chapter on this. It's called Mercenaries in Asymmetric Conflict. The White Legion leaves Zaire, something like that. And they give in like this kind of very military analysis of the White Legion's performance and the rebels' performance, and a lot of like tactical jargon, all this kind of stuff. But one of the first and major problems that they point out is the inefficient command structure. Yugo Dominic and Pelamish were not very effective field commanders, and if you think about it, of course, the 10th Sabotage Division was never built for kind of this frontal warfare or whatever. They were supposed to be a commando unit that goes behind enemy lines, plants bombs or whatever. They're not designed for doing this anyway, and that's not really what they did.
Yeah.
That's not what they're famous for. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So on in that respect, they weren't able to like, effectively deploy their units in creative ways, and they opted mostly to kind of stay around their base and in Kisangani and just kind of do stuff around there. Nor did these guys have any experience with like adequately directing air power and coordinating air power with land. Like these aren't like generals or something that have like a, vast knowledge of like tactical knowledge. One of them was like a junior officer in like an anti-terrorist unit in a military police form. The other guy was a legionnaire who was also like a bodyguard and stuff.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily make you a great commander. And they of course weren't. So again, with all this air power, they did very little to like halt the advance. They did some bombing raids, but again, like They didn't really know how to use this. They didn't really care about this at all. And one of the pilots died, but not due to air, ground fire or anything like that. I think he clipped a tree or something, taking off and died like that. So here, I'll read just a little segment from that book.
Okay.
For instance, the 200-strong force commanded by Jugoslav Petrušić under the Dom de Guerre, Colonel Dominic Yugo, was not divided into independently deployable units. Rather, the force usually operated as a single mass of troops. A member of the White Legion argued that Petrušić was the leader of all of our operations and directed his subordinates in virtually all aspects of their operations, including how and when to utilize their weapons against the rebels. Consequently, Petrušić's men, who reportedly, quote, obeyed their colonel like dogs obey their master, did not launch operations on their own accord, nor did they have anything else to try to stop the rebel advance without his direct authorization or participation. For a small military force confronted with an enemy closing in on multiple fronts, this style of decision-making proved disastrous because the mercenaries waited until multiple rebel units arrived in the Kisangani area before mounting the last-ditch defense under Petrušić's direct command.
Yeah.
So not great. But ultimately, I think the most decisive factor in their inability to combat the rebels was the pure financial motivation. Because if you remember, the 10th Sabotage Detachment was also primarily motivated by money.
Yeah.
Right?
Which is why they're mercenaries.
And they're paid for by the action. And these guys just didn't particularly want to risk their necks. Again, from that book. Overall, it is clear that the mercenaries were truly soldiers of fortune because, save for the operation on March 10th, they had effectively stopped fighting within a month of their arrival in Zaire after realizing that they would be paid regardless of whether or not they risked their lives in combat.
Yeah.
So, they got there. They got, I think, an advance, and they knew they were going to get paid.
Well, what about the humanitarian action that they were supposed to do?
You get to that. There is actually maybe something that they did. Whatever. But I think this is kind of the crucial difference maybe between the mercenaries in the 1960s, who maybe perhaps were more motivated in the sense that the Rhodesians and South Africans who made up a majority of the unit were terrified of black majority rule in their country. They had a kind of vested interest for shaping independent African countries towards, their kind of white power structure that, and wanted to maintain that dominance and are, very clear on that. In this case, they don't care.
Yeah.
They lost, first of all, the war that they were fighting pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
They just killed tons of people. And then they go to Zaire and why would they, fight this massive rebel army with the fucking Rwandans and 3 other countries are involved.
Yeah.
What do you expect them to do? Not only do they not care, they're just bad at it. But, so how did they spend their time there? And I think that's basically just doing what they did best, which is drinking.
Mm-hmm.
And this is in a lot of there's lots of I don't know, journalists that were there at the time pretty much all say that they were kind of drunk the whole time.
Yeah.
And that's drunk and mistreating civilians. I think that's basically what they were doing. So all these accounts talk about how Yugo Dominic was personally took part in basically they would arbitrarily detain any man that if they didn't produce some sort of ID, they would accuse them of being a spy or a potential rebel, and then they would just torture them or kill them. And that seemed to be what they did.
Yeah.
And including I guess shooting a couple of Protestant missionaries.
Okay.
That Yugo Dominic accused of being spies because they didn't, produce ID or whatever. And they're look, we're missionaries. And he shot him.
Do you know from where were they?
I think they were Congolese.
Oh, okay.
So yeah. But to their humanitarian mission, Dominic claims that they did rescue, now he's not a wordsmith. That they saved refugees from the Tingi camp. And there's a video of him and another guy standing in front of like thousands of people. Now, the Tingi Tingi camp was a real thing. It was a huge refugee camp that was then, like dispersed, and some of them were massacred and the like by the advancing forces, and mostly Hutu refugees who did then come. This is like south of Kisangani, and then were like pushed towards Kisangani. So, I mean, there's a chance that, yes, maybe they, protected some of these fleeing people, or at least didn't torture them or something. But yeah, that's I think the extent of what we know of his kind of rebuttal to the "you just got drunk and tortured people" thing.
Yeah,
he said that the heroic Serbian army saved all these refugees. Well, he says there were like 1 million of them in the camp, and it was big, but not that big. So unwilling or unable to halt the rebel and Rwandan advance, the White Legion withdraws not too long after they come there, right? But not before doing an act of sabotage, which is, what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, it's in their name.
Which is basically blow up the entire Kisangani airport and all the ammo dumps and all the stuff that they left behind to prevent it from getting into the hands of, the rebels. And there's a interview with one of the members of the division by journalist, I think Suzana Šašić, where it says, she quotes one of these members saying, "We fought for President Mobutu. We were fools. If we'd fought for the rebels, we'd stayed longer and earned more. Our job was to prevent rebel actions. We carried out some big operations, such as mining an airport that the rebels were about to take. We placed 5,000 kilograms of explosives on that airport. After the explosion, 4 buildings could have fit into the crater." But, this is what they're doing while they're withdrawing.
Yeah.
So the biggest action they did is withdraw, basically. So, yeah, I mean, I guess Mobutu thought he was going to replay the 1960s. You get a bunch of these guys in there. They have an air force. They'll do all this stuff. It just didn't happen. Instead, you got a bunch of drunk, unmotivated war criminals, as opposed to, I guess, motivated war criminals that were there in the 1960s who made their money and then left. And as for Mobutu, the rest is history. We know he was unable to halt the advance. By mid-1997, he had fled the country, I think in May, first to Togo and then to Morocco, where he would die in September of 97.
Okay.
Of prostate cancer. So that finishes the Congo chapter, but I can go on.
Okay. You should. Yeah, what happened to Dominic and all
what
these,
happened to Dominic?
all these guys?
All these guys. The mad lads who were there for adventure. It's curious. The New York Times doesn't talk about him like this in the 1990s. There were a bunch of drunk Serbs torturing people, as opposed to like the drunk British guys torturing people, but they're adventurers and mad lads. Whatever. I think Serbian media at the time did also refer to them. Yeah. Zairian adventures, Dominic with African and Serbian. Yeah.
Of course, adventurers.
Yeah, adventures. So back in the home country, the 10th Sabotage Detachment members were once again reactivated in the Kosovo War. In 1999. Where it starts getting into this kind of crazy story of the...
So they're the 10th detachment of the Bosnian Serb military officially, but now they are participating in a war in Kosovo.
So that unit had disbanded.
Okay.
But what comes to follow is kind of a joint, basically Dominic and Pelemish kind of cooperating together, although later they have a falling out from what I understand. And so they once again become active in the Kosovo War, where they, again, they say that they volunteered and they were fighting in Košare on the border of Albania, and famous battle there. Although, the things that they later get in trouble for is that basically the two of them and maybe some of these others had kidnapped some Albanian civilians and then demanded that their families send them, I think, 20,000 Deutschmarks and so then release them. And they they killed another couple of civilians that
Yeah.
this is things that they got in
continued
trouble
their
for.
adventures.
They continued their adventures.
They're basically Indiana Jones, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. What's interesting later is that they get implicated in this plot to kill Milosevic.
Yeah.
Which seems to not have been real. What do you know about that, Ray?
I only remember the end of 90s, there was like some campaign in Milosevic-controlled media about that some like mercenaries were arrested who had a group who planned to assassinate Milosevic, and they were controlled by foreign intelligence.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that, no, he was not planning. They were not planning to assassinate Milosevic. I think what happened is, after they lose that war, there were a lot of armed units because they let all these paramilitaries and stuff go wild down there. There's a similar story with the Jackals, right?
Yeah.
This paramilitary unit that did all these war crimes in Kosovo. After the war, they're still under arms and traveling, like they're going to Montenegro, and then they get like some of them get arrested. The state's like, hey, you can't just carry weapons around anymore. Your war's over. You got to stop. And I think that this is the case for them, because I think what they really they got caught with all these weapons. I think Dominic says like, yeah, we had all these weapons at my apartment and they took them away. But since he was like a French intelligence agent, he was then, accused of trying to assassinate Milosevic. Although maybe, who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Who the fuck knows?
As for, the rest of the gang, these former members of the 10th Sabotage Detachment, a lot of them end up much later, for most of them, getting convicted and jailed for genocide, crimes against humanity, stuff like that. Especially the guys, the 8 guys that directly took part in the killing of 1,200 people. So one of them, that guy Marko Boškić, again, one of those ethnic Croats from Tuzla, he had managed to escape to the U.S. And it's kind of a crazy story. He had been living in Boston, and hanging out with like the local Yugos there at like a Bosnian cafe, all this stuff. The guys, people there, he worked construction. All the other Yugos there liked him. He was like a drunk and crazy, but like none of them knew that he did Srebrenica.
Yeah.
And they were just kind of hanging out with him, and then he gets arrested. I think like on an unrelated like drunken assault charge or something like that. And then it turns out that they find out that he was lying on his for his status in the U.S. And then he gets jailed in the U.S., eventually deported, and ends up going to prison, I think, in Bosnia. Like some of these other guys, Stanko Stevanović, I think he changes his last name to Kojić later, but he was convicted, I think, in a Bosnian court, and ended up, I think, getting like 30 years, 40 years, or something like that. Remained to the end like a crazy psychopath. I think that he's the one that during his trial like wore like a giant cross.
Wow.
And was like spraying holy water around. It was like actually crazy. I mean, because Palamish, avoided prosecution and spent a lot of time just talking to the shittiest Serbian media, like, Mladić on TV Happy and stuff like that. He talks a lot about stuff. And, they all like basically kind of say, oh yeah, Savanic is like literally mentally ill. But then, Palamish is like, I tried to like do right by him and like, give his life order or structure or something. Like, oh yeah, you made him the guy that was like happy about like knowing how many people he killed.
Yeah.
In Srebrenica is like, oh, he's not mentally well. You're kidding. Like, and also like you did a great thing for him. You really stuck out for him. And then, he of course denies his criminal connections to being like, no, he was never a serious guy. He just wanted to be with, the cool guys. I think he later, before he gets, convicted for genocide, he gets arrested for like human trafficking, that kind of thing. So, no, he wasn't a real criminal. But then we get into this kind of into the mix of like what the implication of Yugo Dominic's relationship to foreign intelligence, and then Bellamich's also connection to foreign intelligence means for this kind of
So what is Bellamich's connection with foreign intelligence?
he was also arrested as, I think, a French agent as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think doesn't really deny it.
Do you know anything about that?
I should, but I can't off the top of my head. But I do know that, for example, this comes up in the Milosevic trial at The Hague.
Mm-hmm.
I think Radon Karadzic also tries to say that, like, okay, yes, something happened in Srebrenica, but it was conducted basically it was orchestrated by the like foreign intelligence to make them look bad.
Yeah.
Which is, always their excuse. Like anytime there'd be like a big massacre and be like, no, that, that mortar was fired from Bosnian army positions because they don't want us to look bad. And it's like, as if everything else you did, like that wasn't like the big massacre was also, just fine.
Also, these people, even if that was true, they didn't kill all the people who were killed in Srebrenica. And they absolutely were working for the Serbian state security, but even, not connected to that, you had the Scorpions there, who was a different unit who had no connection with French intelligence and so on.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is where it gets kind of into conspiracy territory. And if you start reading, like, if you go into like Yugo's stuff, they're also like implicated, I think, in the massacre in Tuzla.
Mm-hmm.
In May, I think, of 95, right, when the shell killed all those people in the city center, which they deny. And then I don't know, Petrosic Colonel Dominic tries to make all kinds of. He has a whole theory about that, even with like, I don't know, some sort of dioramas to show where this. I don't fucking know. It's too crazy for me to even talk about here right now. But yeah, I mean, it's a weird, in general, it's a very weird story. The whole presence of the White Legion at the end of Mobutu's regime in Zaire is strange. And in kind of an odd way, it's like, if we think about Mobutu as this, as I talked about him before, as this like Cold War character.
Yeah.
This is like the decisive end of the Cold War.
Yes.
Right? Because this is like, not only is he gone, the people that were there to support him are the like Yugoslavs who, a guy literally named Yugoslav.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a direct inversion of like the socialist Yugoslavia's role in Africa, because it did play a very large role in Africa in like the independence period and in some of these conflicts. I mean, it was the only non-African country that was part of what became the Organization of African Unity, like as like an observer state. If we're talking about Angola, which is a big part of this story, before the Cubans come in, Tito is the main supplier of arms and expertise to like the MPLA, and the Angolans play a big role in Mozambique as well, Algeria, all these kinds of things. So like you have that history of the Cold War, with the Yugos kind of on one side, Mobutu on the other. Then Mobutu's gone, these guys are there. It all falls apart. They fall apart. Yeah, it's just kind of this. I don't know. To me, it's an interesting kind of culmination of all these strange factors, right? Because Colonel Yugo was active in Africa, but with the French. Yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah. I will try to look into that. What the Bellamich's connection with the French intelligence? When did it start? Was he already connected with them when Srebrenica happened, or did it happen later?
I think it happened later, but then they're like kind of once an agent, always an agent. That. And of course, these conspiracy theories with the involvement of foreign intelligence, like you understand where they come from, because it is crazy that, for example, like the head of Serbian state security was a CIA asset. Yeah, like all these things. But the CIA hedges their bets on everybody. On a lot of people. They had connections with everyone. Yeah. So like that doesn't surprise me in some ways. But yeah.
Wow. So this is a very interesting story.
Colonel Dominic was not able to save Mobutu.
No one was. It
No one
seems.
was. I mean, he died fucking like a few months later. I mean, it's not like.
And do you know what unit they had in Kosovo in 99?
No, they were attached to different units, and actually, some of them then became. They didn't finish their mercenary work. Some of them, I think, Yugo and maybe Mladić, were hired by the Macedonian security in 2001 in the insurgency that they had there, the Albanians.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they took part in that as well.
So the state used them against Albanians in Macedonia, the Macedonian state.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's really like, talk about participating in every single thing.
Yeah.
Like if you look at Mladić, like from Croatia, Bosnia.
That was the last Yugoslav war. Yeah.
And that was the last Yugoslav war. Then they were in Macedonia.
Yeah.
It was pretty crazy. And then Zaire in between.
Yeah.
Very, very weird.
Extremely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's it for us today. I mean, maybe there's enough for a bonus episode if we get into like some of Yugo's weird conspiracy theories.
Oh, okay.
About like how like Tsars control the world.
Yeah.
It's a weird one.
He has something against the Morlocks.
He does have something against the Morlocks.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's it for today, man.
Great. This was great.
All right, guys. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Ray here. I had a dream, and it was that I won't be working in call centers anymore. And you can help that dream become a reality by going to pt.2 and subscribing. And if you're German, or Austrian, or Eindeutsch, whatever you people call yourselves these days, doesn't really matter. The fact is, your grandfather killed my grandfather. He marched down the street in my hometown, renamed the square fucking Adolf Hitler Square. You think I'm kidding? All of this actually happened. And you should feel bad about it. I don't care if you were born in 97 or wherever you were born. This is not normal behavior, okay? You're not normal. I know people from all of the continents, no one thinks you're normal. But there's good news for you. We made a special tier just for you so you can pay 10 times as much as a normal person would. It won't make you normal, but it will make you feel better. Okay, thanks. Bye.